Welcome to this Radiant Energy podcast. I'm Joëlle Mastelik, working for the Sweet Lantern project. This project is financed by the Swiss Federal Office of Energy. And today we will talk about impact assessment in living labs. In research, this is a field that is not much explored, and we are really happy to have a specialist of impact assessment today, Roger Baer from the University of Bern with us. So welcome to this Radiant podcast. I'm really happy to have you here.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm very pleased to be here.
So Roger Baer, you are working at the University of Bern, and for Sweet Lantern, you are a researcher.
Yes, correctly. I'm a senior research scientist at the Center for Development and Environment, short CDE, at the University of Bern.
Mm-hmm. And today we will talk about impact assessment. So what is your background?
I'm a trained environmental scientist. Mm-hmm. So I did my master's at the University of Geneva. And after that, I did a PhD in geography and sustainable development at the University of Bern.
And that brought you to impact assessment, so?
Not directly. During my PhD, I started with energy. It was more about modeling energy supply. It was in the context of biomass fuels in East Africa. Mm-hmm. So cooking fuel is very important there, so I tried to assess the sustainable potential supply there. And then as a scientist at the Center for Development and Environment, I started several projects related to impact assessment. And since we have a very strong focus on transdisciplinary research, so involving lots of stakeholders participating in the research, I got into assessing the impact of those research projects and also the far-reaching impact those projects have.
And you have written an article on impact assessment for living labs. This is what we are talking about today, and to understand more about your work. So I'm really pleased to know more about impact assessment in living labs. As I see living labs, I have done my PhD on living labs in the energy field, and I think that these innovation labs are really important in region in order to implement this energy transition and to test different interventions. So how do you see this function of this living lab? How it resonates for you, these living labs?
So the living labs are, for me, a very suitable tool to foster and test new solutions for today's problem, mostly related to sustainability. So it's really about involving different stakeholders, and this in a real-world context. So for me, it's really, as compared to traditional research and development, for example, where you would be in your company or in your laboratory and you try out to come up with something new, and then you go out into the new world and test it. In a real-world lab, you actually start already in a real-world context with the development or also the identification of the problems you want to tackle. So this is really, it provides it's a robust frame to be also applied later and be successful.
Mm-hmm. And we were discussing when we were preparing the podcast about technological innovation and social innovation. And you mentioned that in terms of social innovation, that's also something that is really important to test in real life and to use this living lab as change agent. So how do you see this social innovation and how it can change the practices that we want to change?
Yeah, exactly. So it's really the difference. So technical innovations you can just do in a lab and then test it in the real world. social innovations. You can't develop something with a community, with a society, only within your company or within your laboratory. So you need a real world context to actually come up with these solutions, with these innovations, and to develop. So it's really crucial to have that real world and living experience to come up with solutions.
Mm-hmm. So in these living labs, there is a lot to measure. So what are your research measuring? What is your focus on this impact assessment for living labs?
There can be different aspects of what you actually measure, and I think that's a very important thing to be clear on. What are you aiming to measure? This helps also within a living lab for communication, and if you don't do that, it's almost one of the main ingredients for failure, like in the measurement then. So we can, in a living lab, we can, in a very simplified way, distinguish between two different things. So we measure the processes, so how we actually conduct a successful living lab. What do we need to do to be creative, to come up with solutions and ideas, and then also to successfully implement them. That's sometimes also called formative evaluation or assessment. So you really try to improve the processes that you have.
It's like action research, like you are trying during the studying of your system to change something so that it's performing better, the process, is that right? Or
that's right, yeah, exactly.
Yeah? Okay.
So it's really like improving your living lab, what it needs for getting better. And then you have the summative approach, which is a more end-focused approach, meaning you want to see the impact of, for example, your innovations or your changes that you came up in your living lab. So if you take an example of an intervention, a technical intervention or a social intervention, you would want to see how much energy you save at the end. That could be your goal of a summative evaluation, which is different to the formative, which is what worked in our living lab to come up with solutions.
Is it right that the formative is like the pathway and the process, and the summative is more about where you want to go and then how to achieve this, or with different stages?
Yes, I would, in a very simple way, I would describe it like that. Yes.
And what are these summative approach that you use? What have you proposed in the Sweet Lantern project to measure with this summative approach? So
in the Sweet Lantern project, the starting point was really the overall goal of the consortium's goal. So in a very simplified way, reduce the greenhouse gas emissions while keeping or even increasing well-being of the concerned people. So that's the starting point. And then we have different living labs that try to find solutions. How can we contribute something to that overarching goal? So they try to find solutions, and what we would measure, or we are interested in, so how do those interventions reduce CO2, greenhouse gas emissions, and the well-being? Ideally, we would be able always to measure that, but that was then not always possible, so we had to simplify a little bit. And we were really focusing on the individual solutions or interventions that the living labs created. So it was really the focus. What does do those solutions change in respect of greenhouse gas emissions, rather than how can we improve the living labs and their processes themselves.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, measuring the intervention and the results and impact of the interventions.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So maybe I could provide an example.
Yes.
There is one living lab that came up with an intervention or potential solution, and the idea was to test it. In very short, it's about people are provided with public transport tickets for a month.
Free of charge.
Free of charge, they don't pay anything.
Nice.
And they're asked, okay, you have now a possibility to use public transport for free. Try to use the car less and see how it goes, whether it's not really the thing, you still use your car. Just, you have the possibility, and now we see what's happening. So that's the intervention that happens. And then we're interested in, okay, now what happens? So do people actually change their behavior? That's the first step. And then by changing their behavior, you could estimate, do they actually use less, the car less, and is the greenhouse gas emission then smaller of those people?
Mm-hmm. So the researcher have this idea of doing an intervention, and you're there to support the measurement, to know if it's valuable or not to do this type of intervention. And you said that you are using the theory of change. Mm-hmm. So what is this model for? How are you using this for this type of intervention, to measure the intervention?
Okay, the theory of change was really the starting point of our work with all the living labs and the people that created intervention. It is, in simple terms, a theory of change is an attempt to explain how you achieve a certain goal. So you want to achieve something, and you explain what you're going to do to achieve that.
So in this example, what would be what you want to achieve?
In this example, it's you would aim to people use their car less. That
Mm-hmm.
would be the outcome of that intervention. So we really want to use people, the car less. And what we do for it is this provision of free public transport. So we have an activity, and we have kind of a goal, reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And the theory of change is really showing this, what we do, and where what we want to achieve. So we start from our main goal, what we do, and we try to explain what happens in between. So going back to our example, we provide the public transport for the people. We pay for that, they don't have to pay. And then we have assumptions in between. We don't do anything, but things happening. So we know, okay, people might use it sometimes. They don't need the affordability criteria of public transport is not important anymore because it's for free. And then we have already a reduction of the car use, and a reduction of the car use means less greenhouse gas emissions. This is in a very simplified way.
Mm-hmm. And then you try to standardize this for all the different interventions.
Mm-hmm.
And what would be because I don't remember exactly, that was this activity.
Mm-hmm.
And then what are you measuring on a standardized way, so that you know for each and every intervention that you are able to compare them and to know what you are measuring?
Yes. Yeah, exactly. So the theory of change, the good thing about that, it's don't have much terminology. You just start saying, what do you want to achieve? What do you do to achieve it? what happens in between. And people can draw bubbles with some text in it and arrows and show it in a very nice way. So there's not much discussion about terminologies, and almost everybody can do it, everybody understands it. The disadvantage is it looks always different. You can't really compare it with other interventions. So there's different frameworks that kind of categorize this process of theory of changes. And one of the most common one is called the logical framework, in short, LogFrame. That's a framework that was initially developed in the development agencies and NGOs. And it consists in a simplified way of 4 components, sometimes of 5 components. First is the inputs. So how much resources, people, time, money do you invest in your activities? Then the activities and the outputs that you achieve with these activities. So if you take the example, take the example at the end, then we have the outcome. That's usually what change you can produce in your targeted population. And then you have the impact. That's the overall goal or the greater goal you want to contribute to. So if you take the example of the 30-day one challenge, the input would be the money we would invest for providing those people with public transport tickets. That costs money, it costs us time, it costs us personnel to actually inform people about the possibility to promote it. So that's the money, the time, the humans that we invested. And then we have the outputs. That would be the people that we reach. For example, the number of people that we contacted. Then it's already a bit borderline discussable whether then how many people participate. You could say it's a direct output, or you could say, okay, that's already an outcome because that's kind of a change within the targeted people. So a decision to participate, that's already a change. Some people would do it like that. I would put it in the output though. And then people actually, okay, they have the possibility now to not use the car, so they don't use the car, they use public transport. That's a change within your targeted population. And then at the end we have the impact, which is actually the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. There you just usually contribute to. So you do not change completely the greenhouse gas emission of people. They will not go to zero or close to zero just because of that, because cars and transport is just one part of people's CO2 emissions. But yeah, that's where you aim and contribute to. So it's, in short, those 4 categories: the inputs, the outputs, the outcomes, and the impacts. And going back to your question for standardizing, so we took all the theory of changes within the consortia's scope that we had. So we took the initiatives or the things that were tested out or that are going to be tested. We created, together with the stakeholders, we built this theory of change. And then as an evaluation team, we kind of labeled those theory of changes elements and put it in the frame of this framework. So we had all labeled the same way. And then we saw where do we have common things, where do we have different things. And based on the common things, we came up with a common framework that is really based on this log frame, but is able to adapt all the theory of changes of all these different interventions in the Lantern project.
Mm-hmm. So if I just want to check if I understand everything correctly. So we have a goal, like the energy transition in Switzerland,
Mm-hmm.
and we are trying to test it with different interventions, how we can change the systems, like the mobility system or the housing systems. And we have this goal that you call the scope, where we want to go. And then we test a portfolio of intervention, and one in the mobility was this 31-day challenge. And in order to know if we are closer to this final goal and the impact that we want, we are measuring different stages, like before the intervention, the activity that is conducted after the intervention, and like maybe the long-term impact of, in 2050, reaching this energy transition in the mobility field. Is it an oversimplification, or is it correct?
No, that's completely fine, correct, and not at all oversimplified.
Yeah. So you are not measuring what type of tools you are using during these interventions?
No, in what we did, it was really about the impact of the interventions, not about tools to actually come up with interventions.
Mm-hmm.
So that was out of the scope of our research that we did. It was really about measuring the interventions.
Mm-hmm. And not about the laboratories, that you were not measuring the impact of each living lab?
No. So it was really not how to improve the living lab, how to better come up with better solutions. This would be again this formative evaluation. So we really had the goal of the summative evaluation of interventions. So in an ideal world, what we would have at the end would be a portfolio of interventions where we know if you conduct these interventions, you can, for example, reduce greenhouse gas emissions by this and this number. Well-being stays the same, and you can say, okay, under these contexts, I think this would work, and then you have like a portfolio of potential solutions that you can apply, working towards the overall goal of net zero greenhouse gas emissions.
So if I am a project manager or a city planner and I have to conduct intervention and I want to know, is my intervention successful? Is my plan successful? Is my activity successful? So what can they learn from what you have done in your research?
The first is always, so how much was the reduction of greenhouse gas emission? This would be the goal, and the impact on well-being, like the key thing. But then not to neglect or also the assumptions or that and the context that is behind. So all those interventions, they're situated in a specific context. So if an intervention works in Sion, it might not work in Zurich, or it might. So the question is, how can you then scale or transfer those interventions? So you might want to make your intervention bigger in Sion because you know it worked, so how can we make it bigger? How can we reach other people? If you take the 30-day one example, you can also say, okay, it worked in Winterthur. Can we adapt it in Sion? And these are the things, so the transferability of the intervention or the scaling of the intervention. This is very important, and for that you also need to know kind of the criteria, what helped to make it work or not. which brings us to one point of the theory of change that I did not mention yet. I was explaining you have your activities and how you go to your goal. You achieve your goal. And you show the steps, what happens, and you achieve your goal. So that would be more like a laboratory, like an isolated case. Real world is different. So we have a lot of external factors influencing things. If we would take another example, which is not a case, but in the Lantern project, but I just use it as an illustration, you would launch an awareness raising program on energy saving heating. If you did that 2 years ago, then you might be very successful because people saved energy using their heating less, but then the reason might not have been because of your intervention, but because at the same time the federal government actually launched a national initiative on awareness raising on energy efficiency. So things like that needs to be considered and taken into account. So already while thinking about your theory of change, you should try to think about those external factors and assumptions you have. Are you the only one impacting, or are there other factors? And then measuring these things is very difficult, especially in the living lab context, because we don't have isolated cases. In research, the holy grail of measuring impact would be the randomized control trial, the RCT, where you have two groups. One group is affected by an intervention, the other one isn't, and they don't know, both groups don't know whether they're affected or not by the intervention. A living lab, by definition, that doesn't work like that.
This is in a real environment where you cannot control everything. Does that mean that it's less or more valuable than a controlled environment, or is it used in different stages?
It's just different. You can also kind of, in the ideal case, it would be you would have quasi-experimental designs. There, usually it's more about available resources for the impact assessment, because it is a lot of work, hence also a lot of money. And then if this is not possible, you try to approximate however you can. And within the project, we try to support the different living labs by providing IDs and a template for a questionnaire they could provide to the targeted people. But then as well, it always needed a certain kind of adaptation according to the initiative and intervention.
Mm-hmm. Sometimes I call it pre-living lab settings, where you can control everything and you have measurements in a controlled lab with different types of actors, in the contrary of the real world, which is like a bit fuzzy and more difficult to control, but you can also see what happens directly on the practices. So I think it's really interesting. Thank you so much for the work that you have done in impact, because I think that we are missing research on impact assessment in the innovation lab, in the change labs. So that's really important that we can continue to deep dive, and also to work on the scaling up and scaling out. We are really missing research. This fundamental question, oh, that's great what you do. Can you do this in 10,000 cities? And we are not there yet, but I think that we are testing in 5 cities in Switzerland. So I think it's really great that you can measure everything. Thank you for your contribution and to be there today.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
For me as well.